What is your darkest family secret? Part 2. My parents are cousins. It's actually very common in the South Indian culture they're from, and there's a few such pairs in my extended family, though only cross cousins, i.e., when the cousin couple's parents are opposite genders, e.g., my dad's mom is my mom's dad's sister. If the parents are both brothers or both sisters, then that's called parallel cousins and is taboo. It's weird, but living and having been born in a Western country where it is, for good reason, a big no-no. I am always afraid of people finding out. When I was a kid and my mom was asked how she met my dad by other people, she always gave the answer they were childhood friends. Technically not wrong, I guess. I remember once though, when my white violin teacher asked her in my presence, me saying they were cousins because I was small and didn't know the taboo, and my mom then telling me in the car not to tell people that. I didn't learn why for a long time after. It always sucks though, seeing discussion on interbreeding and the moral, legal and medical disdain it brings, and don't get me wrong, I do agree with it, and knowing I'm a product of it. Well, at least luckily me and my brother don't have any incest-related developmental disorders, that we know of anyway. My dad gave a job to a cousin. I remember as a kid that this cousin I'd never heard of just suddenly popped up out of nowhere without explanation, but I was a kid so didn't really think of it. But everyone made a big deal out of how great it was for my dad to give him a job. I found out 20 years later that he'd been in prison for having a sexual relationship with a student. Lot of fucked up uncles in this thread. My dad's 6-year-old sister was murdered in Seattle in 1936. It's still Seattle's oldest unsolved murder. It was never talked about in his family. I finally found out all about for him. My grandmother was married 3 times, not twice like I'd been told. Apparently her first marriage was to a gay man and quickly dissolved. This was presented to me as a big family secret, but I like cool, I'm 12. But I did end up digging up their marriage certificate on Ancestry in college. My great-great-grandmother had a black father and was considered really taboo in the 1860s. My great-grandmother is 98 years old and was telling us about a guy who was black and absolutely adored her in the 1920s and early 30s and would come over to play with her, but the family had to keep it a secret as he was black and she was white. Story goes that her grandmother married her grandfather. My great-grandmother's mom had to pretend that he worked as the help on the farm in South Dakota when he was really his father. She told us about it when my grandfather did an DNA test and it came back that he was part black and had black family members. We only found out last year. I have an aunt which was hidden from me until 2019. My grandmother had her during WW2 before she met my grandfather. When my dad was born, they decided to hide her at my great-grandmother's house. My aunt was basically raised by great-grandmother. What's even more heartbreaking is that whenever my dad would visit my great-grandmother, she would hide my aunt. So much that my dad never knew her existence until recently. My mom and dad contacted her and eventually visited her. She had a harsh life from the start. It's an utter shame. Sorry for my English. I'm French and a bit emotional right now. Oh. A variety, lots of sexual abuse. A few suspected murders. Think hillbilly elegy crossed with The Sopranos. My grandfather, dad's side, committed suicide by driving his car into a wall under a bridge, leaving behind his wife, my grandma, and 10 children. That was in 1970. My aunts and uncles refused to call it a suicide. They just refer to it as the accident. Fast forward to 1987 and my dad named me after the sob. My family is boring. The only thing I can think of is my uncle is an alcoholic. My great-great-uncle murdered his second wife and threw her body in a lake. He lived at my family's cabin in his later years after he got out of prison. According to what I read, she wanted to leave him and they got into a fight. Next thing everyone knows is she turns up missing and he's the last person who saw her alive. My uncle passed away in 1991 from AIDS. He was living in California when he was diagnosed, and came home to Philadelphia for his final round of treatments and lived for another year. When he got there, my dad told all family and friends that it was cancer. My dad loved his brother, but was ashamed of the stigma of the virus at the very least. My mom told me that she was the one who took care of my uncle's crate of gay porno mags. Apparently he didn't want anyone else in the family to see it. Makes me sad that he had to hide his authentic self all the way till the end because of how my dad tried to control the image of the family. My step-great-grandfather raped everyone in the family. All of the kids. Male or female. Everyone pretends my great-grandmother was a saint. But she gifted the kids to him and pretended not to hear them scream for her. My cousin sexually abused me when I was 7, he was 17, and it messed me up, and now I have to pretend I'm happy he's getting the organ transplant he needs. I hope he fucking dies. Nice try. If I tell you, it's not a secret anymore. My cousin was murdered. Someone killed her and 2 other people with a shotgun. We had to get her cremated because she was in no condition where we could have had an open casket. Back in the 1960s, my grandmother shot and killed my grandfather with a shotgun. In front of their 16-year-old daughter, my aunt. Apparently grandmother felt she was in a bad situation. Grandfather was 32 years older than her, she was his secretary before they were married, and their marriage had been very unhappy. So she cleared it ahead of time with the small town sheriff's office. Put my aunt in the room as a witness. And blew a hole in his chest. Never faced any legal consequences. My mom, who was only 5 at the time, found out a few years later from a nosy neighbor. Dad's cousin was a prominent Catholic priest known for his staunchly anti-LGBT views. Well, it was quite the surprise when he was arrested trying to solicit a blowjob from an undercover cop at a gay bookstore in New Orleans. My stepdad used to beat my mom. The whole family. Both sides. Still don't know to this day. I'm the only one my mom ever told. I'm debating on whether or not to tell everyone at his funeral when he finally does the world a favor. My great-great-grandmother, single, came over from Germany after WWI. And had a kid 2 months later. She met a guy and worked for him for about a decade. Mysteriously having 2 more kids during that time. Eventually she got married and moved away. And left the kids with the man. She eventually had my great-grandfather. And he grew up without knowing anything about his half-siblings. That was until about 70 years later when one of their daughters sent a letter to my grandma explaining their relationship. They promptly met up and realized they had only been living about 20 miles from each other. And the relationship rekindled from there. They even came to my grandpa's funeral in '99. Where it was revealed that some of the family actually did know about them all along. When people asked how they were related, the older family members would refuse to elaborate and would brush them off. My father, however, would make sure to tell the story to everyone who asked. And made sure these older family members could hear it all. My elder sister by 10 years had a different father from my mother's previous marriage. My parents decided, in all their brilliance, that they would only tell her the truth on her wedding day. Like there's nothing else on your mind that day. Right? Makes sense to tell your kid that you're not the father and won't walk her down the aisle. Jesus Christ. She was his damn kid. And he was involved in raising her since she was 4 years old. They let her grow up for decades of her life wondering why I was the only grandchild who got Christmas or birthday gifts from my dad's parents. And cried herself to sleep at night for years wondering why our grandparents didn't love her. She ended up finding out after a friend of hers once got drunk and shouted, "At least I know who my father is." My sister confronted our parents about that. Who then unceremoniously told her the truth. I don't understand how people can be so cruel. And I've been no contact with those parents for years. For many reasons. But I'm happy that my sister is doing well. Now. She got married a few years ago in a small ceremony in Las Vegas. And our parents weren't invited. I feel genuine schadenfreude about how offended our parents still are about that to this day. While visiting my mother's native country back in 2004. I would hear someone whimpering/crying every night when it was time for bed. I would mention it to her and she thought I was crazy. Turns out there was a room between where my aunt's house and the neighbors are where they housed young girls for sex trafficking. My aunt had no clue this was going on. But she was always caught up in some weird shit. No one wants to believe my aunt was part of it. But it was just really weird. Before I was born, my uncle was a sympathizer/supporter of the brutal regime that was in control of our country at the time and was rich because of it. He and his family looked down on my parents and their family, who had been well off before losing everything when the regime took over. One day, my uncle comes home to find his wife dead. There was never any proof or arrests. But everyone in my family says it was his kids who poisoned their own mother. Adding fuel to the rumors is that all his kids ended up abandoning him when they grew older. Something that doesn't happen too often in my culture. Generally children are supposed to help take care of their parents in their old age. The first and last time I saw him, he had been living by himself in poverty for years. Our family tolerated his visits, mostly out of pity and because we don't have much family left. But they still remember what he did to our family. My grandfather was killed in a bar when my father was still a toddler. The official story was that he was murdered over a pinball game. Back then pinball was pretty serious, I guess. It wasn't until recently my grandmother confessed, on her deathbed, that my grandfather actually killed someone and buried the body days before his own demise. So he was actually killed in retaliation for a murder that he committed. My grandmother kept the secret for almost 65 years. Thanks for watching.